Hi, I'm Susan Cawley and welcome to You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability. The IEP, or Individual Education Plan, is a legally binding document that explains exactly what services your child will receive from special education and why. Now, I know that a lot of times when you go to an IEP meeting, you expect a little give and take, but it's really important that a parent knows what to expect when they go to an IEP meeting, because sometimes they won't tell you, the education services won't tell you that you have options. So I have three excellent guests with me today. First, Ellen Scoggins, who's an educational advocate. Then I have Beth Bostick, who's the Vice President of the Special Needs Advocate Network. And finally, Janine Solomon, who is the staff attorney for the Disability Law Center. Thank you very much for coming today. Well, the first thing that I really would like to ask is, what is the first and foremost detail do you tell parents to concentrate on when they first go to their IEP team meeting? Who would anyone like to start?
Sure, I would love to start. Thanks, Susan. When I meet with parents, I like to have them create a vision for their child. I like them to focus on a one-year time period to figure out their vision for their child and where they want their child to be. In addition, I like them to think about the 3 or 4 or 5 priorities that they feel the child needs in the next year, and then we move forward from there.
Does that include possibly like whether they want their child to be inclusion, or whether they want special services, anything?
Whatever the vision is, I want my child included in general education. I would like my child to have friends. I would like my child to be successful, to be reading at grade level, whatever their vision is for their child, so that they can think it, write it, and then we can work toward their vision of where their child will be.
Okay. Does everybody else agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. I also would like to expand a little bit on it. I try to help parents to understand that the IEP is really about skill building. So when you're thinking about your child over the next year and what it is that you want them to be able to accomplish, that very often helps you to drive what skills they need to be building. So the more behaviorally specific they can be about that, so it's not just, I want my child to be included, but think about the barriers that are preventing them from being included, and those really help you to understand, therefore, what skills they need to be working on. And the more you can actually picture that behavior changing, the more accurate you will be in being able to write a vision statement that really helps you to then go on to say, therefore, these are the skills or the goals in the IEP that we need to include.
Are you allowed to read a vision statement when you go to an IEP? I mean, will they allow you to do that?
I often encourage parents to make sure that they actually come with their vision statement already written, so that that can be part of kind of the launching pad for the meeting. Anything that you can do to really help the entire team visualize what the target is for the year is really important to do. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Janine?
Yep, I think those are excellent points, and in addition, there's a few pieces. In addition to the vision, I have found at team meetings that the teams really like to emphasize it's a team vision. I think until the child turns age 14, the team is going to have, the whole educational team is going to have some input. And I've seen it, and for my own daughter, I've written it where you can write the specific family vision as well as the team vision, and those can hopefully coincide. So that's one piece. A lot of times too, they're looking for the parent concerns that they would like to include as part of the first page of the IEP, so they'll ask families for that, so that's something to be thinking about. And then I think what's also important is you should have notice of what the team meeting is going to be about. It may just be for your annual review, but that way that will help you to prepare, to be thinking back through, as my colleagues mentioned, thinking back through of the year and the progress, or perhaps a lack thereof, and looking at skill building. You also, again, it's going to be ages and stages, so you're going to be thinking about if you're closer to transition age, the focus of the IEP may change, and the focus of the meeting may change, because it may be something in addition to an annual review.
Truly.
Well, I have another question. And I know that every year you have an annual review. Are you allowed to call team meetings at any time of the year that possibly because of some reason that the IEP can be amended, or can it not be amended? Is it just a year, you have to follow through the plan for the whole entire year?
No, there can be
Absolutely.
amendments to an IEP. I'll just start off, and then you
Sure,
all can jump
bite my
right in.
tongue,
I think the thing to take caution with is that you're not always going to be calling a meeting. You know, I think it has to be a balance between how often. But obviously,
Okay.
if your child is struggling, if there may be a new diagnosis that comes up during the year, if there's disciplinary problems, there could be a whole host of reasons. You may want to go ahead and call a meeting by all means, and there may be an addendum to the IEP at that time. There may need to be evaluations that are off cycle. There could be a whole host of reasons. And you could also write into your IEP under additional information. Sometimes, depending upon the nature of the child's disability and some of the services, you can agree with your team ahead of time that you may meet quarterly. And so you may already have that in your ed plan.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's important for parents to understand that the annual meeting is the minimum requirement for a year. You will meet with your team at least once a year. But at any given time, if there is everything in your IEP is needs-based, so if a need comes up or additional information that's really helpful to the team comes up, then you can call a meeting to actually have the team come and discuss those needs and then see how that impacts the IEP.
I really, for some reason, don't believe a lot of parents know
They don't.
they have that option. I think they think that they have a yearly review and then that's it. They don't hear again from the team till another year. But that's really a good point to know.
And I think it's important information to share with a parent, that you are able to call a team meeting at any time. And as Beth talked about, you might have it regularly scheduled, or Janine quarterly. Oftentimes you can create an IEP and you need to follow through to make sure that they're implementing what they should be implementing.
Right.
So oftentimes if the team is scheduled to meet regularly, they tend to implement and do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. You can call
That's
those
very
progress meetings, for
important.
example. I love putting progress meetings and additional information. But it's a great way, it helps the team to really see whether or not what they've put in, especially if you're dealing with a challenging situation and it's the first time that you're using a particular approach to resolve the issue. You know, you want to find out sooner rather than later if it's working. And sometimes having those quarterly meetings, as Janine mentioned before, is great data collection. It's a great opportunity to really check in and say, okay, this seems to be working, but this piece isn't, so what can we do to adjust it? And it really keeps the team focused on the needs of the child and really addressing those needs effectively.
Great. Now, when you first have your IEP, who actually goes to the IEP? Who is invited to the IEP? And can you invite someone outside of a parent, either for support or another professional?
Yes. I'll start, okay? I feel like I'm getting ready to do a basic rights workshop. Your IEP meeting is going to include, of course, yourself as a parent. The child, if it's appropriate, at age 14, it's mandated that they're actually invited. And then you'll have at least one special educator, one general educator. You'll also have what we call the district resource, the person who knows all the resources in the district and who has the authority to deploy those resources. You want that person in the meeting. And then any of the service providers or other relevant people who are included in the IEP to actually facilitate the IEP. I also encourage moms in particular, even though I can say it's really great to see that I'm seeing more and more fathers at meetings as well. There's more and more partnership going on, which is awesome. But moms tend to be the lone rangers who go into meetings and therapy sessions and doctor's appointments, and they follow through. I always encourage them to bring at least one other person with them, if for no other reason, for emotional support, and sometimes to be your reality check afterwards. Sometimes we don't hear things the way they're intended. They can help us to hear them the way they were intended, or to affirm what we did hear. And then ultimately, in the end, if for some reason you do find yourself in a position of needing to go through due process, that other person serves as a witness as well. So they can really help corroborate your story.
Can they just show up to the meeting, or do they have to notify the IEP team that this particular person is coming?
So,
Go ahead.
So for example, if a family hires me, I advise them to let the district know that I will be attending. I don't like any surprises. I don't want to tick the district off before we start the process. You know, anything.
That's very true.
Well, and you also, it's a courtesy. I mean, it's nice to keep the doors of communication open, let them know that you're coming, and especially if you're bringing legal counsel, then you really do have to tell them, because they're going to want legal counsel present as well.
Right.
Going to say that.
What happens when you show up to an IEP meeting and there's one particular person that you really feel it's essential that they be there, and you show up at the meeting and they aren't there? What can you do? Do you have the authority to say, let's meet again at another time, or will they pressure you to continue the meeting anyway?
It's in the law that you are allowed to call the meeting at that point in time and ask to reconvene. They should be giving you advance notice. Sometimes, unfortunately, it may only be minutes before your meeting. Sometimes it may be a day. It just depends on how quickly, because sometimes there are legitimate reasons. There's a death in somebody's family, and it is an emergency, and so there's a last-minute notification. But by law, they should be notifying you. You have the option to call the meeting, and again, particularly if it's somebody who is essential, as you said, and they're going to be presenting a report, they really need to be there. I have seen it sometimes, and you all may have different experiences, where sometimes a meeting may be able to go on and then be reconvened for that person to be able to present their report as a way to continue the meeting and at least have the established time and go forward.
And as Janine mentioned, I had a meeting last week and was not able to attend. I had a death in the family, notified the parents, they notified the district, and we were able to reschedule. And they thought it was, you know, essential that I be a part of the team, and most districts are fairly accommodating.
Do you feel a lot of people, especially these days, with so many services and so many variations of things, do you recommend that people have an advocate? I know that's a sticky situation, and if so, does the parent have to pay for the advocate, unfortunately, or is there any way a person can get someone like an advocate who they don't have to pay for?
Okay, I'll start.
You can start that way.
I am private pay by the parents, so of course I would recommend that the parents bring an advocate. Oftentimes a family is not making headway and the child is not getting the services they need, and the family will contact an advocate to help in the IEP process.
Okay.
There are intern advocates and agencies, Mass Advocates for Children, Disability Law Center. There are agencies that have attorneys and advocates that will help you, that will work pro bono. And I think it's important, depending upon where you are in the process, you know, as I say, most of the time a family's contacting you because they're not moving forward.
Right.
So an advocate or an attorney is very helpful in that process to educate the parents, to help them figure out what they need, and to move the process forward.
But the other thing to keep in mind, though, is, and I'm sure you've probably experienced this too, I find the #1 reason why parents aren't moving forward is because they don't understand how to navigate the system.
Yes.
And so
I totally
even
agree.
before you get to, and there are, of course, I am also a private pay advocate, so I always advocate for advocates. But, but that being said, there are resources out there where if parents were to educate themselves more on how to navigate the special education system, very often they may find that they don't need the advocate as quickly. Or on the other hand, they may find that because they have a child who's particularly complex, that it's helpful to have an advocate, not because things have fallen apart, but just because they need help getting through the process. They don't know what they don't know. They need to know what questions to ask. So I think it's a combination of accessing courses like Basic Rights and IEP for my child, those courses that are available through the Federation for Children with Special Needs that are free. It's always, I find that I work better with parents who have a knowledge of the law anyway. You know, otherwise I spend a lot of time coaching them on
Right.
what that is.
Right.
So I think sometimes there are some parents who can navigate the system just fine on their own, and there are others that need help. Some of it comes down to how you're socialized. Are you used to being in a team meeting? Are you used to
Right.
working with people? Do you come from a cultural background where you're not used to having to be so assertive or
Right.
to ask questions or feel like it's inappropriate to question authority or question what people are saying? So I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. And then in terms of funding, there are a number of resources out there. SPAN does work with a couple of agencies in terms of a grant that we've provided in the last year, depending on your qualifications on whether or not you're part of DDS and Mass Health, you can get some funding towards advocates as well.
Yeah.
And there are a number of agencies, as she had mentioned before, that will give you some pro bono or sliding scale. And there are advocates out there who will do the same thing as well. So there are a number of ways to get them. It's like anything else in special needs, you kind of have to know where to look.
Right.
I think too, you make some very good points. I think it's cost effective to be bringing an advocate. I do feel that a lot of times an advocate is a good way for the family, as you said, to have a sense of understanding their IEP, feeling that they have somebody who's experienced by their side, could walk through the goals and objectives, can walk through the services with them. I feel that with a lot of times with bringing attorneys in, it's usually prior to going to a hearing that you may have your attorney or you may be already involved. But a lot of times I feel that it's better to keep the attorneys out because it gets more litigious that way. And once an attorney shows up, the school district's attorney, it's always, you need to be able to notify
And
them.
everybody gets nervous.
Right, and it brings it to a different level that it may
Right.
not need to go to. So I
Right.
think it keeps it more civil if you do have an advocate. And I was going to say in addition that sometimes the families are working with service providers in the home, community-based service providers, and oftentimes even though some of those providers are not trained from the educational aspect, they at least can come and be with the family and talk about certain services or certain things that they may be seeing in other environments, which can be really helpful to bring to the team. And your point is very well taken about the families that are lower income, of different cultural backgrounds, of different linguistic backgrounds, to make sure that interpreters are there and to make sure
And I
that
don't think a lot of parents either, they're not really told anything at all. And especially when my kids were young, they're in their 20s now, there was virtually no help. And unlike now, but you were kind of lost when they said, oh, you have to go to an IEP meeting. Well, what's that? You know, kind of, attitude. Anyway, one of the things that brings this around is how does a parent know what services to request for their child? I mean, there are so many disabilities out there. What can they expect to ask for, and what are their parameters from the educational aspect? What can they expect to get from whatever they're talking about?
Well, I think it's important. Parents don't necessarily, at least in the beginning, as you get get more skilled at it, you become very clinical. I feel like I have a medical degree at this point sometimes. But I think parents, they don't know what to ask for in terms of services.
Right.
And I think in the beginning it's less important to know specifically what service and more important to know, again, the skills that need to be developed and how those skills impact a child's ability to access curriculum and access the life of the school and access the community as a whole. If you can understand that and really work on writing really solid, measurable goals to help them to be able to overcome those obstacles, then the skills, the services that are needed become very clear. So, you know, for example, if you're talking about a child who needs to be able to have an interchange socially with somebody, then it becomes very clear that you need social skills, and that means you might be working with a speech and language pathologist who might also be working with a behaviorist depending on the level of impact their behavior is having on it.
But what happens if they definitively tell you, okay, your child definitely needs speech. We can give you an hour and a half of speech a week.
Well, and that may or may not be appropriate. It all goes back to
how would you know
it goes
that
back
would be
to
appropriate
it goes
or
back
not?
to assessment. You know, one of the things that I tell parents is anything that happens in special education is going to be based on data and assessment. So what's going to be really important is that you get assessments that really help you to have a clear picture on what the deficits are and how they impact a child. And that is what actually drives what the needs are as a result, what the skills are that need to be developed, and therefore what the skills are, what the services are as a result. So it all goes back to the data.
And
Okay.
sometimes the families are working with independent evaluators, they're working with medical doctors or other doctors that treat their child, whatever the disability is or the multiple disabilities. They may have a team of people, and those people through their evaluations may also make recommendations on amount and type of services that can be shared with the team.
I see.
And I believe it's important that the advocate at the team meeting help guide that process. So you may have documentation, you may have the doc that did the evaluation, present or not, because again, that would be at parent expense. But the team and the advocate has the expertise to help guide the team to consider the services and to get those services implemented, because that's what the child needs at that juncture.
And then also to talk about the differences between, very often medical professionals will make recommendations that school districts don't necessarily agree with.
Right.
And some of that is because medical professionals are looking at the maximum benefit and they're looking at you know, the best possible scenario.
Right.
And that often clashes with this term we have called FAPE, which is the free and appropriate public education, and the term there is appropriate. It's not about necessarily what's best for the child, but what will help them to make effective progress and help them to pace as close to their peers as possible.
Right.
So any child would benefit from having, you know, one-to-one service all the time. A typical child would benefit
Right.
from that. But the question really becomes, is this service or is this environment critical to them being able to make the type of progress we need them to make so that they can be pacing with their peers? And that's really the underlying question.
All right, so now we back up a little bit. What about evaluations? When is evaluation first done, and how often are evaluations done? And the second part of that is, do parents pay for these evaluations, or is it mandated by the state that these evaluations be provided when they notice that a child isn't in an age-appropriate level in education?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
A lot of questions.
How much time do we have? Want to get started on that one?
Sure, I'll start.
Off and running.
So an evaluation can be requested by a parent, it can be requested by the district in any suspected area of disability.
Okay.
It can be requested at any time. Typically, evaluations are done once they're done every 3 years, but again, at any time in the process, if something changes up.
Now, is that by the school system?
That's by the district.
By the district?
Correct.
And by law.
Okay.
And by law.
And by law.
And they can be done as often as once per year. Now, it also parents can also use resources outside of the school district. The school district is primarily focused on where is the deficit and how does it impact a child at school. They're not in the business of diagnosis. They are more in the business of identifying the deficit. And so very often those assessments can then be taken to an outside assessor who may have more expertise around really identifying, well, therefore we have a child with dyslexia, or therefore we have a child on the autism spectrum. And here is some more information, because they can do some more detailed assessments that a school district may not have the resources for, to actually tease out more about what this means for the child. What does that mean?
The school district basically gives a general assessment as to where their skills are, and then you as a parent have to go and take that a little further to a professional to say, okay, these are where the skills levels are. Now I need to find a diagnosis.
Yeah,
Is that how it works?
Pretty much. I mean, the school district can still act on the information that they have when they see the deficits, but one of the qualifications for being on an IEP to begin with is to have an actual diagnosis. So it's important to make sure that parents understand, you know, there are 3 qualifications. One is to have an actual diagnosis. What is the disability? And then from there, is that disability impacting their ability to make effective progress in school? And if so, do they need specialized instruction to access the curriculum or related services, to access the life of the school? And if, in fact, the answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, then they qualify for an IEP. So the school district is of course going to want to do their own assessments, because their primary focus is, how do we educate this child? But there will also be some other information that comes from other sources that help you to better understand what are some of the other implications for this child as a whole.
Okay.
And just a few more points is that the actual form that you use is a consent to evaluate form. They cannot evaluate your child without getting your consent.
Correct.
And it's a form that is produced by the Department of Education. It's on their website. And what it does is that it lists various types of evaluations that typically get done at the 3-year mark, but many more can be added to that. So for example, they might do an educational evaluation, a psychological assessment of the child, or a psychoeducational evaluation. They may do the specific related service evaluation, speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, but particularly as the child gets to transition age, there is a section of the form which we often counsel families to consider, is that you can ask for additional evals. You might ask for a functional behavioral assessment. You might ask for assistive technology evaluations, particularly around transition age. Specific age-appropriate transition assessments and vocational assessments, independent living skills assessments are really important for families and school districts to consider. And then the last piece is also the independent evaluation. You were going to maybe ask about that next, but if there is a point where an evaluation is not conclusive, or you feel that you need a second opinion, there is a process by which a parent can request an independent evaluation to be conducted, and where the school then goes and gets that taken care of. Sometimes it is definitely on a sliding scale, but sometimes depending on if the family receives free lunch, they can be offered for free, and they can get the second opinion, or families, if they have the means, can also go to an independent evaluator themselves and to bring that to the team.
Now what about about early intervention?
Okay, can I just add one more thing?
Go right ahead.
So the other
Yes,
piece is oftentimes families' insurance will cover an evaluation.
Exactly.
So
Oh, okay.
if that's
Good.
the case, would encourage the family to go through their insurance. I mean, we had a neuropsych done. I did for my son at my insurance expense, and it was absolutely the way to go. A much better expert following my son than the district had.
Yeah. But the other thing to keep in mind is, if you're going to use someone outside of your school district, make sure you take the time to find out if this person is credible.
Right.
Because you want an evaluation that's going to be taken seriously. It could actually be a piece of evidence that if you end up in due process, that the hearing officer is going to rely on in terms of information. So you want to make sure that you have somebody who is going to look at the best interests of the child, not be necessarily swayed by parent side or a school district side, but is really looking at, who is this child, what do we need to know about them. Because there are some evaluations, and I'm sure you could probably think of some instances where if I hear a particular evaluator's name, I know exactly what the report's going to say. So you really want to make sure you have someone who's going to do a thorough, user-friendly report that helps identify the need, and it also helps give practical solutions, things that people can actually do.
Yeah.
You know, not
If
pie in the sky.
if a child's in early intervention, does that automatically do they automatically get evaluations, or
Nothing is
it
automatic in the
nothing
process.
is automatic at all?
Such thing
Needs
as
to be
automatic.
requested,
Needs to
and
be
it could be
requested.
requested by the family. It could be requested by a service provider that the family's working with, EI. It could be requested by the
Well,
doctor.
how do you get into early intervention? I mean, do you have to have like an obvious disability? Is that how it works? I know my children went into early intervention, but I can't recall exactly what
It's a phone call.
transpired.
Often the trigger is I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but often the trigger may be a pediatrician or somebody who's working with you who will refer you
Possibly
into
that.
it. But it
Okay.
really is, and parents, it doesn't preclude parents from making that phone call themselves and just saying, you know, my child seems to be struggling in this area. Could you come and take a look at them and see whether or not they might qualify for services?
Sometimes it's
okay.
known at birth. Sometimes
Yeah,
a
well,
child is born
yes.
blind. Sometimes a child is born with cerebral palsy.
Right.
You might know from birth if they are, and then that.
Or sometimes you have a child with a disability and then a sibling. You think, maybe something will be up
Something
with the
is-
sibling.
Yes.
And you know, you would call and say, hey, you know, I have a kid and he went through this, and
Yeah.
could you please evaluate my other child? Just
Oh yeah, that's
For
happened to
peace
me.
of mind, yeah.
Now, what happens when parents go to their IEP meeting and everything they've planned and everything, and the school system presents them with a program or whatever, and the parents feel that the services offered aren't sufficient or appropriate for their child? What do you do at that point? Do you try to argue, or do you feel that if they don't really kind of move on any issues, that you have to go out and hire a lawyer to represent yourself?
I think that's where the advocate comes into play, so that oftentimes a family will hire an advocate after they go to a meeting and they're not getting appropriate services they feel for their child. I believe it is the advocate's job to work with the family and the team to figure out what's in the best interest of the child and how to get that child these services.
The other thing too is I think it depends where you are in the process too. If it's the first time that the school district is introducing a proposed placement, then it's important to remember that you do have an obligation to at least look at it and to consider it.
Absolutely.
If this is another one of those places where it may be appropriate to have those progress meetings incorporated into your IEP, because you may feel like your child needs more, but there's this term called least restrictive environment in special education, so it's important to make sure that we've tried everything that we can before we get into more restrictive environments or more restrictive service delivery. But you need to, again, go back to that data collection. So it's important to say, okay, well, I may not agree with you on this, but we're certainly willing to give it a try. And let's agree as a team when we're going to come back and review this and see if it's being successful. And if it's not being successful and we kind of agree on what the criteria for success would be, then what are we going to do differently as a result? So, and I think you're absolutely right. Having an advocate as part of that process is very helpful, also just to help kind of keep everybody honest, document what it is that everybody's saying, hold everybody accountable, including the parents, because sometimes we can get very emotional as parents. So it's important to really keep that collaboration and that give and take going, because there may be occasions where what the school district is providing is absolutely appropriate, and there are other occasions where the parents may be absolutely right, and there are occasions where it's somewhere in between. So it's really important to make sure that you continue to work with each other and communicate with each other, and really keep in mind it's always about the data. So what can you put in place to really document how effective the interventions are for that particular child's needs?
Right. Well, time is coming to an end here, but I do want to ask one more question. When a parent rejects an IEP, can they reject a part of the IEP or the whole of the IEP? And if it is rejected, what happens to the child? Does the child continue the services as is until new services can be implemented, or basically what happens after, when it's rejected.
No, I'll take a brief stab and then you all jump in. You can reject in whole, you can reject in part. And what's important is there's 2 signature pages on your IEP. There's the signature page for services, for the goals and objectives and services on the IEP, and you can reject in full or in part for those. And there's the placement. So it's always FAPE in the LRE, and the placement, it can also be rejected in full perhaps, or you can accept it. You could always accept, reject in part, or reject in full. And I think what's important is that if it's your first child's IEP, you need to be extremely cautious, because if you reject in full, you will get no services. So that's very important. But if you have an existing IEP, the last agreed upon IEP, if you have rejected the newly proposed one, it will revert back to your last agreed upon IEP, which is considered your stay put IEP. And by signing in Massachusetts that your stay put rights are in place when you reject in part or reject in full.
Yeah. So at the point that you actually reject any portion of the IEP, the school district is required to report that to the Department of Education. And the parents then receive a notice that very often looks very frightening, because they see they just scan it real quickly because it's a very densely written thing, and they see the words hearing and mediation. They're going, oh my God, the school district's taking me to court. And all it really is the department notifying you of what your rights are, what you can do from that point. So anytime that you reject any portion of the IEP, there is also a section on the signature page where you can request a meeting to discuss the areas that you have disagreement around. And we always encourage parents to do that. You want to take the opportunity to do that. And then if in fact you still can't come to resolution, then there are a number of ways to resolve it, be it a settlement agreement, a hearing, a mediation, a facilitated IEP. There are a number of avenues that you can use to resolve the difference. And while you're resolving that difference, whatever was in the previous IEP stays in place until you've been able to come to an agreement on what you're disagreeing on right at that particular point.
Is there a time frame that, like for instance, what happens if you can't agree for 6 months or a year? I mean, that would really hurt the child, I would think.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is until due process is actually pursued, the stay put rights stay in place. So if neither party decides to pursue due process, then whatever services were in there before stay in place. It's only when due process takes place that then things will actually change. So you're right, you want to do things as quickly as possible, because I have had cases, and I'm sure you have as well, where the stay put rights have been in place for a year or 2 years, or you can't figure out which service from which IEP is in place. So, and that can get very confusing, and that only adds to the tension that's amongst the team, which is something you don't want to necessarily foster. So it's important to, once you've done that, to really do anything you can to pursue the due process so that you can actually come to resolution and move on.
And sometimes time gets in the way, for example, extended school year services. If the process to resolve the issue is longer than 3 months and the summer has passed, so timing is critical, and it is a process, and you just have to figure out, a plan to move forward.
Right. Also junctures as well. If the stay put IEP was for middle school and your child's moving to high school, again, you're going to keep the services, but be moving the placement. So it gets very tricky. And I think what we've said and what is so important is collaboration is key, to really be working with your team and keep the lines of communication open as best as possible.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for coming and explaining some of these details about IEPs. I'm sure the parents are really thankful that you came. I know that I have some questions that I had answered. But anyway, thank you very much for joining us today on You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability. Again, thank you very much, and have a good day.